The first thing that you see in this little handout that you have is a beautiful chart that sums up some biomes. Now, a biome is a type of ecosystem that you find in the biosphere. So we talked about what the biosphere is and what its components are. Now, when we talk about all of the different types of ecosystems that can exist, some of them are on land and some of them are on water. We're going to focus just on the ones that are on land, and that's what a biome is. It is a terrestrial ecosystem. Now we're going to talk about very broad categories. Keep in mind that we could further subdivide each of these categories into a bunch of different specific, smaller types of ecosystems. What we're doing here is picking big, large categories so that we can compare across the whole entire planet things that affect climate. So if you look at this, along the side are a bunch of factors, and along the top are a bunch of biomes. So that's how this is set up. Now, I've put 6 biomes here. Keep in mind that these are very general, very broad categories. We could make more specific categories by dividing a bunch of them up into even smaller groups, but I don't want us to focus on the details. I want us to focus on the big picture, which is always what is affecting climate. What kind of things will affect temperature and precipitation? So the first thing that I want you to notice is the location. You'll notice that I didn't give you like a country or a spot in the world, but rather I'm indicating latitude to you. That's what all of those descriptions are about. And for each of the biomes, I didn't write a number. I could have. But what I wrote was, where is it compared to either one of the poles or to the equator? So notice that, for example, the tundra is polar. Polar means north or south pole. It doesn't have to be the North Pole, but that's as far away as you can get from the equator. The taiga is just south of the tundra, and it could actually be just north of the tundra if we were talking about the South Pole and then coming up from it. What I'm trying to say is it's not quite at the pole, it would be the next step. We have 2 that are midway. So there's a temperate forest and there's a grassland. These 2 are partway between a pole and the equator. So they're not at the poles, they're not at the equator, they're somewhere in between. And when I'm saying midway, I mean somewhere in between. It might not be exactly the halfway point because we're using very big categories here. The other 2 are equatorial. That means they are at or around or right on the equator. Now the reason for telling you the latitude of all of these places is because latitude affects insolation. Remember, insolation is the opposite of albedo. It is not insulation with a U. That's the stuff that you put in the wall of your house. It's pink. Insolation is how much sun a place gets. And we discussed at the beginning of the unit that depending on your latitude, the angle of incidence of the sun is different. The closer you are to the poles, the more area the same amount of sun has to cover, whereas when you're close to the equator, the sun is hitting those areas directly. More sun for the same amount of area. The next category is precipitation. Now I put some numbers here just so that we could compare, but I'm absolutely not going to ask you to memorize numbers because these are just very general averages. What I want you to recognize is which ones are big, which ones are small, which ones are medium, so that you could compare them to each other. So for example, in the tundra, there is very little, and it is almost 100% snow. It's not ever rain because it's too cold there. The other one that's very low is the desert. So if I showed you a biome that had very low precipitation, you should choose from one of those 2 biomes. And the type of thing that I would normally ask you to do is, based on a description, tell me which biome it is I'm talking about. Now I want you to notice these two, the taiga and the grassland. Now, grassland, you might have also heard referred to as prairie. That's us. That's where we live. Grassland, prairie. There's lots of different kinds of grasslands. Some of them are very similar to what we are living in here. But so that you know, the savanna, which is the grassland that you would find, say, in Africa, where a lion might live, would also fall in this category. So there's quite a bit of variety. But the idea is that these two biomes, taiga and grassland, get some precipitation, but not a lot. So these ones are not as low as the desert and the tundra. We'll call them medium amounts. They get some precipitation, but it's not a ton. Then we have the two forests. The difference between the two forests is really based on their latitude. One type of forest is farther away from the equator, the other one is closer. The tropical rainforest obviously has the most. Other types of forests have high amount of precipitation, but not quite as high as the tropical rainforest. So if I was going to ask you about precipitation, I don't necessarily need you to give me a number. I need you to give me a description. Is it very little? Is it a medium amount? Is it a fairly bigger amount? Or is it the most that you can have? Now, over here, average annual temperature. So we're not talking about fluctuations between day-to-day measurements. We're talking about, on the whole, what's the temperature like? Notice that in the tundra, below zero is frequent. It's below zero most of the time there. That doesn't mean that it can't go above zero sometimes, just that it would be very common for the temperature to be below zero. So it has the lowest temperature. And what you should recognize is that temperature and location follow each other almost exclusively. So if I look, the things that are closest to the poles are the coldest. Taiga comes next, so it's a little bit warmer than the tundra. The two that are midway are a little bit warmer, and the two that are at the equator are the ones that are the hottest. Now, the difference between the tropical rainforest and the desert has to do with water. And because of that, in the desert, it's very hot during the day, but cold at night. That's because there's no water around to help moderate the temperature. As soon as the sun goes away, there's nothing there conserving heat. Now, those are the things about climate. These two categories are just examples of which type of living organisms might you find there. Now, this is just a small selection of examples. These are not the only things that could be true, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things that are distinctive. For example, in the tundra, there are no trees. You might have heard of the tree line. The tree line is where trees stop growing, and past the tree line, that we would call it tundra. So the difference between the taiga and the tundra could be whether or not there are trees. Because other than that, their climate is very similar. They're both fairly cold, they're both fairly dry. The tundra is colder and drier, but that could be a distinctive characteristic. I'd like to point out the word lots in the tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest has the highest different number of species that would exist there. So there's lots of different types of plants, lots of different types of animals that exist. If we are in the grassland, shockingly, we would mostly find grassy plants. It's not saying there's no trees or no shrubs, but most of the vegetation would be grass type. In the desert, remind yourself that there's very little. There are not a lot of types of plants that can survive in the desert because plants depend on water. In the animals section, again, there are lots of things that could be true. So this is not an exhaustive list. It's just an example of what might be there. Keep in mind that especially in the first two categories, the animals that live there are ones that can survive during the winter. So very often, things that camouflage or change their fur color, those types of things live in the tundra or the taiga because they're adapted for winter. The other thing that I want to mention over here for the prairie or the grassland is because remember, it's not the only type of grassland that there is. I put animals that live in our area of prairie, but I could equally have said like a lion because the lion lives in the savanna, which is a different type of grassland. So the type of question that I would ask you about biomes would be something like, hey, I'm in a place where it's cold and there are no trees. Where am I probably at? Well, you would say that kind of has to be the tundra because of the places that are cold, it's the one that doesn't have trees. So I wouldn't expect you say from nothing to fill this whole chart in. I would expect you to recognize from a description with a couple of different facts. So I might tell you the precipitation and the temperature and a plant. Could you tell me which of the 6 it is? Now another type of thing that I'm going to ask you to do in reference to biomes is talk about specifically the climate. So temperature and precipitation. And we're going to make some graphs. That's what today's assignment is going to be about. So that you have a really good idea of what temperature and precipitation are like, the next diagram that's on your handout sums up those two things specifically. Oh, that's rather big. Let's see if we can fix this. There we go. So on this diagram, you'll see that there are even more categories than what I listed on that first chart. And that's because we could divide things and get more specific until we've identified each tiny little area as a different ecosystem. But if you look at this, it's showing you on one side temperature, on the other side precipitation. And so it's a way to look at all of the biomes together when we're comparing these two factors. If you look at the precipitation, see it's high over here and low over there, but on the temperature scale, it's low up here and high down there. So it goes backwards. And so what you should notice is these are the hottest. This is where you find the wettest biome. So if I was looking for the warmest, most humid biome, I would say, oh, I have to be in the tropical area because that's the spot on the graph where I have high temperature and high precipitation. If I was looking for something that is cold and something that is dry, I would look at this section and I would say, oh, look, it's the tundra because it is the coldest and driest of all of the areas. So this is just an example. I would not ask you to fill in this entire graph, but I'm showing you a way that you could organize the biomes to remember which one is the most humid, which one is the least humid, which one is the hottest, and which one is the coldest. The reason you need to know that is because I'm going to show you graphs, and that's what's on the next page. So before I go there, would anyone like to ask any questions about what is on the first page of your handout? I don't know why this is so small. There we go. So we are going to make climatograms. That is our goal. You're going to make some today. And so what I want to show you is what this is and what it illustrates. So a climatogram is a 2-in-1 graph. It will show me precipitation and temperature. Now, so that you know when we're making these graphs, we're going to take averages for each month of the year. So when you look at the example, you'll see that along the bottom, on the x-axis, we will have months of the year. Along both of the y-axes, so we're going to have 2 of them, not just one. This is the left y-axis, This is the right one. And I'm mentioning that because on the computer, that's how you'll identify them when you're making your own graphs. Now, there's no rule that says necessarily temperature has to be on the left or right or vice versa, but they both have to be on a y-axis. Only the month should be on the x-axis. Precipitation will always be a bar graph, and temperature will always be a line graph. So if you look at my example, you'll see that there are bars showing the precipitation and then a line showing the temperature. And that's always how it will appear. And then there are a couple of things that you can determine from looking at a climatogram. First of all, the temperature curve. If the temperature curves like it does on this example, where it's lower on the sides and higher in the middle, that's telling me it's warmer in the middle of the year, June, July, than it is in, say, January or December. In other words, it's hot in our summertime. This shape tells me northern hemisphere. If the temperature curve were backwards, it was high on the sides and lower in the middle, this would indicate to me southern hemisphere. And that's because, as we know, the angle of inclination of the Earth causes it to be winter in the northern hemisphere when it's summer in the southern hemisphere, and vice versa. Now again, in terms of temperature, the line might not always have a curve. So depending on the degree of curvature, is it more or less flat? Does it kind of slope up in the middle, or does it have a huge slope in the middle? We can determine how close or how far something is from the equator. A flat line tells me that the place would be equatorial, because when you're near the equator, you are receiving about the same amount of sun all the time, regardless of what month of the year it is. Temperature lines are close to horizontal. Now, they don't have to be perfectly straight, but if they are more or less flat, that's telling you your place is close to the equator. If it's a small curve, like it kind of goes up a little bit or goes down a little bit if it was the southern hemisphere, but it's not a huge difference, that indicates that you're somewhere in between polar regions and equatorial regions. And the larger the slope gets, the closer to a polar region you are. So by looking at a climatogram, you could distinguish where a place was. Now, because we're not using specific numbers, we're using comparisons, there would always be a bit of leeway in your explanation. So if I showed you this exact climatogram and you didn't know where Frankfort, Illinois was, and I asked you, where is it? Well, you would look at it and say to me, well, it goes up in the middle. It has to be northern hemisphere. And there's definitely a curve in the middle. Now, is it a medium curve, a large curve, or the highest curve? It's hard to say without comparing. So if I asked you where this was, as long as you indicated to me that it was definitely not near the equator, then I would believe that your answer would be correct. Now, the thing that amounts of precipitation provide us an indication to is the dominant vegetation that will be found. So by looking at the lines for precipitation and seeing how much there is, this gives you a clue. Is there a small amount of vegetation, a medium amount, or a lot? Now, precipitation, because it tells you about vegetation, would also give you an indication of which animals live there. Now, I could ask you, based on a climatogram like this, what biome do you think this is? And like I said, I would probably accept more than one thing as the answer as long as you explained yourself. But here's the logic that I would use. I like to work with elimination. What is it not? What are the things that it can't be? So I would say to myself, right away, this is not the desert. I would also say to myself, this is not the tropical rainforest. And the reason is the temperature line isn't flat. It has a very distinctive curve in the middle, so I know that I am not at the equator. I would also rule out tundra and taiga. And the reason is, look at the temperature. It gets below zero maybe a couple times during the year, and then it's above zero the rest of the time. So it doesn't seem like it's cold enough to be the tundra or the taiga. Neither does it seem like it's dry enough. The precipitation values are fairly high, especially in the summer. So it seems like I'm getting too much precipitation and it's too warm. So I'm left with two choices. I'm left with the non-tropical forest, the deciduous forest, or I'm left with prairie. And based on this, I think you could make a good argument for either one of them, because I'm not asking you to memorize specific numbers. So if I asked you, which biome is this, as long as you didn't pick one of those four, I would have to say that you are correct. That would be a logical answer to this question. Does anyone want to ask anything right away about this? So the next thing that you see are three different climatograms. And what I'd like you to do is take a moment and think to yourself, what biome do you think those represent? So if you look at these things, you'll see what I've done up here, and this would be my suggestion to you. I just wrote an abbreviation for each of the 6 biomes. Tundra, taiga, the forest, the tropical forest, prairie, desert. And what I usually suggest to people to do is eliminate things that you don't think that it could be. Now sometimes it might be easy to pick one right away because there's something obvious that's giving you that description. So for example, for the third one, if you look closely, it tells you where it is. This is a climatogram of Singapore, and it's categorized as tropical wet. And so if you look at it, the temperature line is basically flat, and the precipitation levels are very high. If you look over here, again, I'm not asking you to memorize specific numbers, but somewhere that's tropical gets in the 200s for precipitation. And so that is what a really high number represents. So if I look here, I would probably for this one just go ahead and pick tropical rainforest right away without even considering any of the other biomes, because it evidently meets both of the criteria. So I think that it's fairly easy to recognize the extremes. Because the tropical forest is the hottest and the most humid, or conversely because the tundra is the coldest and the driest, those two are usually really easy to pick out of the list. Now for the other two up here, it's a little more difficult to pick what they are. But here are the things that I want you to do. For example, for the one in the middle, look at that precipitation. It is incredibly low. And so I would rule out all of the places that have decent amounts of precipitation. So that's the tropical forest, which is the highest. The forest, which has a pretty decent amount. I would rule out the prairie and the taiga as well. So I'm left with two choices, tundra or desert. Now what you'll notice, especially for desert places, is that this line will not be as flat as tropical areas, even though it's very probably close to the equator. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, I picked Phoenix, which is not at the equator. It's slightly north of the equator, so that could be one reason. But also, there's no water around, and water has a humongous influence on climate. It helps keep temperatures more stable. So based on this, and the fact that I can see that the temperature doesn't really go below 20, that does not sound like tundra. This one has to be desert. So keep in mind when you're identifying biome, it's not going to follow the rules exactly perfectly every time because there's not only one factor that influences climate. Now the last one at the top has probably the least amount of distinction in it. I can rule out, based on precipitation, that it's not the tropical forest. I could also rule out, because the bars are quite a bit higher than the one I just identified as the desert, this should not be desert, and this should not be tundra. And then if I look at my temperature values, here's 0. And notice how it stays well above 0 most of the time. And so I would rule out taiga for that reason. It doesn't seem like it's cold enough to be taiga. So I'm left with a forest or a prairie. Now if I look at this, and this is where I would probably accept 2 answers, there's some precipitation, but there's not a lot. When I compare it to the tropical rainforest that had 250, that's still a relatively small amount. So I would end up picking something in the prairie category for that one. I would probably accept if you said the deciduous forest, simply because the values for prairie and forest are so close together. The only thing that's different is the exact amount of precipitation.